Miss Marple and the secret letter in the church pew. Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome to Quiet Clues. I'm William, and it's truly a pleasure to have you here with me for a while. Before we drift into the mystery, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what hour has the night reached for you? Leave a note below and subscribe if you'd like these quiet tales to become a gentle part of your routine. Now let us step softly into tonight's mystery. The Sunday morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, with a clarity that felt almost holy, as if the world itself had been scrubbed clean overnight by the hands of an unseen giant. It was a morning where the dew clung to the blades of grass like scattered diamonds, heavy and cool, and the air held the distinct, layered scent of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and the faint, sweet trail of wood smoke from a distant chimney. The village was at its most peaceful a place of quiet gardens, where the only sound was the rustle of a blackbird in the hedgerow, of soft-spoken greetings exchanged over low stone walls, and the distant, rhythmic clinking of tea-sets being prepared in kitchens, where the light hit the linoleum, just so. But as the bells of St. Bartholomew began to toll, their heavy iron voices carried a weight that seemed to press down on the village green, a sombre vibration that could be felt in the soles of one's feet. To the unobservant, it was merely the call to prayer, the familiar, comforting soundtrack of a life lived in a straight, predictable line. To Miss Jane Marple, however, observing the world from her garden gate with a pair of eyes that had seen more of human nature than most High Court judges, the bells always sounded like a countdown. They were a reminder that even in the most serene moments, time was moving forward, and beneath the surface of the village's Sunday best, the gears of a much darker machinery were often at work. She smoothed her Sunday gloves with a deliberate, trembling care, making sure each finger was perfectly aligned before she set out. She adjusted her hat, the one with the modest silk ribbon that had seen better years, but still held a certain quiet dignity, and began her walk toward the church. As she moved, she noted the small, flickering details that others dismissed as insignificant. She saw the nervous, repetitive twitch of the postman's hand as he adjusted his tie for the 10th time. She saw the way the vicar's wife looked back at her front door with a fleeting, panicked glance, a shadow of an expression that suggested she had forgotten to lock a secret inside the dark safety of the hallway. By the time the congregation settled into the worn, dark oak pews of St. Bartholomew, the air inside the church was thick with more than just the scent of beeswax, incense, and cold stone. It was thick with history, the kind of history that seeps into the wood and stays there for centuries. Every family had their designated place. Every seat held a story of births, deaths, and marriages that had shaped the village. And today, in the 4th pew on the left, a seat that had been occupied by the same man for nearly 40 years, a story was about to reach its final, silent chapter. Miss Marple opened her hymnal with practiced ease. She noticed the dust motes dancing like tiny spirits in the shafts of stained glass light that cut across the nave. She noticed the heavy, laboured breathing of the man sitting 3 rows ahead, a sound that seemed out of sync with the peaceful surroundings, and she noticed, with a sharp intake of breath, the small white corner of a piece of paper peeking out from beneath a discarded prayer cushion. She did not know then that the bells would soon toll for a reason far more sombre than the Sabbath. She only knew that in St. Mary Mead, the most dangerous secrets are often whispered in the holiest of places, and the most devastating blows are often delivered in total silence. Chapter 1. The church warden's final service. The interior of St. Bartholomew was a place of cool shadows and ancient limestone whispers. The walls, thick with centuries of flint and mortar, held the deep chill of the earth, providing a stark, almost startling contrast to the growing warmth of the July morning outside. It was a place where the world felt separate, where the modern age of 1950s England seemed to dissolve into the timelessness of the liturgy. Mr. Imler, Septimus Blane, the church warden, was a man who inhabited his authority with a grim, unyielding satisfaction that bordered on the theatrical. He was 75 years old, with a face that resembled a piece of dried walnut, all hard lines and deep crevices, and eyes that seemed to be constantly searching for a sin to punish, even in the innocent play of a child. He took his seat in the front pew with a heavy thud. the wood groaning under his weight, while his silver-topped cane leaned against the oak like a weapon ready to be drawn at the first sign of disorder. Septimus was not a man who inspired love, nor did he seem to want it. He was a man who demanded order, a man who believed that the moral fabric of the village was held together by the strength of his own unbending will. As the organist began the opening voluntary, a slow, sombre piece by Bach that felt like a funeral march, played in slow motion, Septimus glared at a group of choir boys who were whispering in the stalls. They fell silent instantly, the air around them turning cold under his gaze. Miss Marple, sitting several rows further back, watched him with a curious intensity. She noticed the way his hand gripped the edge of the pew until his knuckles turned a bloodless white. She noticed the slight, irregular tremor in his jaw, a pulse that didn't match the steady, mathematical rhythm of the music. To the rest of the village, he was merely being his usual irritable self, a man, annoyed by the heat and the minor imperfections of the morning. But to Miss Marple, who understood that fear often disguises itself as anger, he looked like a man who was waiting for a blow to fall, a man who knew deep in his soul that his fortress was about to be breached. The service proceeded with the familiar, rhythmic comfort of the Anglican liturgy, a sequence of words and movements that had not changed in generations. The prayers were said in a low murmur that rose and fell like the tide. The psalms were chanted with a haunting, unison beauty, and the sun moved slowly across the floor, turning the grey stones into a kaleidoscope of ruby, sapphire, and emerald as it passed through the figures of saints and martyrs. Then came the final hymn. Septimus Blane stood up, his movements stiff and deliberate, as if every joint in his body were protesting the effort. He reached for his hymnal, the large, leather-bound volume that was his personal property, well worn and heavy with the weight of 1,000 Sundays. He opened it, his fingers fumbling slightly with the thin, gilded edges of the pages. The congregation began to sing, their voices rising to fill the vaulted ceiling. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. Miss Marple, her voice a soft, steady alto, kept her eyes fixed on the back of Septimus's head. She saw him suddenly stiffen, his shoulders locking into place. He didn't sing. He stood perfectly still, his head bowed, staring at the open pages of his book with an expression of frozen, absolute terror that seemed to radiate from him in waves. A small piece of paper, the one Miss Marple had noticed earlier, fluttered from the hymnal. It drifted down through the air like a white leaf caught in a draught, landing silently on the red carpet of the aisle. Septimus didn't lean down to pick it up. He didn't even seem to notice it had fallen. He dropped the book. The heavy volume hit the floor with a sound like a pistol shot, the noise echoing through the rafters and cutting through the music. The singing faltered for a second, then continued, but the nearby worshippers turned their heads, their expressions shifting from devotion to alarm. Septimus reached for his throat with both hands, his fingers clawing at his starched collar. His face, usually so pale and sallow, turned a sudden terrifying shade of deep purple. He tried to speak, he tried to cry out for help, but only a wet, rattling sound emerged, the sound of a life breaking apart from the inside. He swayed, his heavy frame tilting like a falling oak in a storm. He struck the edge of the pew with a sickening crack before collapsing into the aisle, a heap of black wool and broken dignity. The singing faltered and finally stopped altogether. The organist, sensing the shift in the room, let the music trail off into a discordant, haunting hum that vibrated in the silence. "Mr. Blane," the vicar cried, abandoning his position at the pulpit and rushing toward the fallen man. But Septimus Blane was beyond the reach of prayer or medicine. He lay on the red carpet, his eyes wide and fixed on the vaulted ceiling, as if he were seeing something there that no one else could. And just inches from his hand, the small white piece of paper lay waiting, its message as sharp and final as a knife in the dark. The piece of the Sabbath was not merely broken, it was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. In the frantic, breathless moments that followed the warden's collapse, the church of St. Bartholomew transformed from a quiet sanctuary of faith into a theatre of desperate, clashing confusion. People stood up in their pews, the wood creaking under the sudden movement, their whispers rising like the hum of disturbed bees as they craned their necks to see the fallen figure on the red carpet. Dr. Haydock, who had been sitting in the back row hoping for a quiet morning, pushed his way through the gathering crowd with a grim, professional determination. He knelt beside Septimus, his hands moving with a swift, clinical efficiency that only comes from years of facing life and death in equal measure. He felt for a pulse at the withered neck. He checked the dilation of the eyes, and he leaned his ear close to the open mouth to catch a breath that was no longer there. "He's gone," the doctor whispered, looking up at the vicar with a look of resigned sadness. "Heart failure, most likely. It was very sudden, the kind of shock that simply stops the clock." Miss Marple did not join the throng of curious onlookers pressing around the body. She remained standing in her pew, her hands folded over her handbag, with a stillness that was almost statuesque. She was not looking at the fallen man, nor at the grieving vicar. She was looking at the aisle. She saw Mrs. Pringle, the village librarian, a woman known for her immense curiosity and her remarkably fast hands, move toward the front, under the guise of offering help. Mrs. Pringle believed that information was the only currency that truly mattered in a small village, and she was an expert at collecting it. As she passed the exact spot where Septimus had fallen, she stumbled. It was a clumsy, exaggerated movement, a perfect theatrical distraction. She reached out to steady herself against the mahogany edge of the pew, and as she did, her hand swept across the red carpet with the grace of a practiced magician. When she stood up, smoothing her skirt, the small white piece of paper that had fallen from the hymnal was gone. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed into thin slits of blue. She watched as Mrs. Pringle tucked her hand deep into her heavy Sunday coat pocket and hurried toward the side vestry door, her head bowed in a performative display of grief. "Inspector Slack will be very cross indeed," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her voice barely a breath against the cool air of the nave. She looked down at the dropped hymnal lying near her feet. It lay open on the floor, its spine cracked by the force of the fall. Using a clean lace handkerchief, so as not to disturb any potential marks on the cover, she leaned over and peered at the exposed pages. The book was open to hymn 234, but the service board at the front clearly stated that the congregation had been singing hymn 456. Why had Septimus opened it there? Was it a message left for him to find, or was it simply the place where the ghost of his past had decided to manifest? Miss Marple knew that in the geometry of a crime, there are no coincidences, only intersections of intent. Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes, the siren of his police car dying with a mournful wail outside the lich gate. His heavy boots clattered on the ancient stone floor with a lack of reverence that made the vicar wince, and the shadows in the rafters seemed to retreat further into the dark. Slack was a man who viewed every accident in St. Mary Mead as a personal affront to his weekend. He looked at the body, he looked at the doctor, and he looked at the congregation, which was now being held in the sunlight of the churchyard under the watchful eye of a young, nervous constable. "Right," Slack barked, his voice echoing off the stained glass windows depicting the life of St. Peter. "Another accident in this village. I suppose you're going to tell me it was a ghost, Miss Marple, or perhaps a very aggressive case of divine intervention?" Miss Marple, who had moved to sit quietly in the very back row, looked up with an innocent, watery smile that completely masked the sharpness of her intellect. "I think, Inspector, that ghosts rarely have use for stationery. There was a letter. It was inside the hymnal when Mr. Blane opened it." "A letter? Where is it then?" Slack demanded, looking around the empty aisle. "I believe it is currently residing in the pocket of Mrs. Pringle's Sunday coat," Miss Marple said mildly. "She found it, or rather, it found her. Some things have a remarkable way of sticking to the wrong hands when the light is dim." Slack's face turned a deep, dangerous shade of red. "Constable, get Mrs. Pringle back in here, and bring that coat. I don't care if she claims it's her personal property." Miss Marple watched them go with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She knew Mrs. Pringle was not a murderer. She was simply a scavenger of secrets, a magpie drawn to the shiny trauma of others. But the person who had placed that letter in the book, They were something else entirely. They were someone who understood Septimus's rigid routine, someone who knew exactly which book he would reach for at the conclusion of the service, and, more importantly, they were someone who knew the secret that Septimus Blane had been hiding behind his walnut-faced mask of righteousness for 30 long, silent years. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Warden. While the police dealt with the panicked and now indignant Mrs. Pringle in the vestry, Miss Marple remained in the main body of the church. She walked slowly toward the front, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence like the ticking of a very old, very slow clock. She stopped at the fourth pew on the left, the seat Septimus had occupied with a regularity of a planetary orbit for nearly 40 years. It was a throne of tradition, and now it was empty. She looked at the wood of the book rack. It was polished to a high mirror shine by years of contact with Septimus's sleeves, but there were scratches near the corner, fresh, jagged scratches, the kind made by a sharp metal object held by a hand in a desperate hurry. She leaned down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and looked under the velvet-covered seat. There was nothing but a few crumbs of dried mud and a small silver-headed pin lying in the dust. She picked up the pin with her handkerchief, holding it up to the light of the east window. It was a tailor's pin, exceedingly thin, sharp and cold. Septimus was a man of extreme, almost obsessive habits, she thought, her mind connecting disparate threads of memory. He would never have left a pin in his pew. He would have considered it a moral failing. To him, untidiness was the first step on the road to perdition. She walked back toward the vestry, where Inspector Slack was currently examining the scrap of paper he had finally retrieved from Miss Pringle. On the oak table lay the torn corner of an envelope, yellowed with age and smelling faintly of cedar. On it, written in a cramped, shaky hand that looked as though the writer had been fighting against a great weight, were 3 simple words. "I saw you." "That's it?" Slack demanded, throwing his hands up in frustration. That's what killed him? 3 words on a scrap of paper? The man had a heart like a flint. It shouldn't have broken just because of a bit of village gossip. "For some men, Inspector," Miss Marple said from the doorway, her voice gaining a sudden, knife-like clarity, 3 words are more than enough to act as a death sentence, especially if they refer to a ghost that was supposed to be buried 3 decades ago in a place far colder and darker than this church. Slack turned on her, his skepticism battling his curiosity. "And I suppose you have an idea of what happened 30 years ago?" "I know that Septimus Blane was not always a paragon of village virtue," she said, her eyes looking through the walls of the vestry and into the past. "Before he retired to St. Mary Mead, he was the manager at a prominent bank in the North, a bank that suffered a very famous and very violent unsolved robbery." Slack stilled, the anger leaving his face as the professional detective took over. "The Manchester heist. That was 1926. Every inspector from here to Scotland Yard was looking for that money." "The money was never recovered," Miss Marple continued, her voice heavy with the gravity of the story, "and more importantly, the night guard, a young man with a wife and a small child. He died in the struggle. The case was eventually closed for lack of evidence, but the shadow remained. Septimus moved here shortly after. He was a man of modest means, yet he was able to buy a very comfortable house, pay for it in cash, and donate quite heavily to the church roof fund. It is amazing how much luck some people seem to find when they look in the right corners." Slack looked at the scrap of paper with a new dark understanding. "Blackmail. Someone finally found him after all this time." "It would seem so," Miss Marple agreed, "but blackmail is a game for 2 players. The question we must ask is, who was watching Septimus yesterday? Who followed him into this holy sanctuary specifically to plant a message in his favourite book? Who knew exactly where his heart was weakest?" She thought of the congregation she had seen earlier, the village doctor with his tired eyes, the librarian with her fast hands, the vicar's wife with her panicked glances, the choir boys with their scrubbed faces, and then she remembered the stranger she had seen at the Lichgate, a man in a long grey macintosh, who had turned away the very moment the service began, his face lost in the morning mist. She walked out into the afternoon sunshine. The village green was returning to its Sunday quiet, but to Miss Marple the air felt thin and fragile. She needed to find the man in the grey macintosh, and she needed to know exactly why a silver-headed tailor's pin had been left in a church warden's pew. Chapter 4. The Tale's Tale. The following morning, Miss Marple made her way to the high street. The village was stirring, the shops opening their doors with the familiar, comforting clatter of iron and wood against the pavement. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh bread and damp stone. She stopped in front of a small, narrow shop with a faded, peeling sign that had stood against the elements for decades. H. Jenkins, Master Tailor. The bell above the door chimed with a silver, lonely tink as she entered the dim interior. The shop smelled of heavy steam, raw wool, and old peppermint. Behind the counter stood Mr. Jenkins, a man so thin and angular he looked like he might slip between the floorboards if he stood still for too long. He was a man of few words, his life measured in inches and stitches. "Miss Marple," he wheezed, looking over the rim of his spectacles, with a tired kindness that spoke of 1,000 late nights under a flickering lamp. "A pleasure to see you. Is the blue suit in need of repair? I can have the hem seen to by Friday if you require it." "Not today, Mr. Jenkins. I am actually looking for information about a pin, a very specific, very sharp pin that seems to have wandered far from home." She placed the silver-headed pin, still wrapped in her lace handkerchief, onto the mahogany counter. Jenkins picked it up with a small magnet, inspecting it closely under a heavy magnifying glass. The silver head glinted under the shop's yellow light. "This is a specific gauge, Miss Marple, high-grade steel, imported from the north. I use these almost exclusively for silk linings. They are designed to glide through the most delicate fabric without leaving a trace. I sold a packet of these just last week. They aren't common in these parts. Most villagers prefer the sturdier brass ones for their tweed." "To whom did you sell them, Mr. Jenkins?" Jenkins hesitated, his eyes flicking to the window. Then he shrugged, his narrow shoulders looking like a wire coat-hanger beneath his waistcoat. "To a gentleman, new to the village, staying at the Blue Boar, I believe, a Mr. Arthur Penhaligon. He said he was a collector of sorts." "Penhaligon," Miss Marple repeated, the name tasting of salt and old, buried secrets. An unusual name. What did he want with silk pins if he wasn't a tailor? "Said he collected insects, needed them for mounting butterflies. A very precise gentleman he was. Grey hair, grey macintosh, grey eyes. Everything about him was grey, as if he had been living in the fog for a very long time and had forgotten what colour looked like." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back into the street. The man in the grey macintosh. The figure she had seen at the church-like gate. She walked to the Blue Boar, the village's only inner sturdy, timber-framed building that had seen better centuries and heard more lies than the local magistrate. She found the innkeeper, a man named Bates, polishing the brass rail of the bar with a vigour that suggested he was trying to rub out a persistent stain on his soul. "Mr. Farl Penhaligon?" Bates grunted, not looking up from his work. "Left this morning, paid his bill in cash-crisp notes they were, and caught the 8:15 to London. Didn't say where he was going, but he left a package for the police. Said I was to hand it over if anything unusual happened to Mr. Blane. Said he had a feeling the air here wouldn't suit the old man for much longer." Bates reached under the counter and pulled out a small, brown paper parcel, tied tightly with coarse twine. "Inspector Slack is already on his way," Bates added, looking toward the door. "He's got a nose for these things, like a bloodhound in a cheap suit, that one." Miss Marple waited, sitting quietly in a corner booth as the dust mote swirled in the light. When Slack arrived, looking more dishevelled and frantic than usual, he tore into the package with the grace of a hungry wolf. Inside was a leather-bound diary, its pages brittle and smelling of cedar, and a single faded photograph. The photograph showed two men standing in front of a heavy iron bank vault. One was Septimus Blane, 30 years younger and smiling with a predatory triumphant glee. The other was the man in the grey macintosh but in the photo. He was young, strong, and wearing a guard's uniform. "His brother," Slack whispered, reading the note inside with a trembling hand. "Arthur Blane. He was the guard who died in the robbery. Only he didn't die. Septimus hid him away in a cellar for 10 years, took the money for himself, and told the world his brother was dead to keep the secret safe. He turned his own blood into a ghost to build a life of lies. Until Arthur came back for his share," Miss Marple said, her voice full of a deep, ancient pity. "But Septimus didn't want to share. He wanted his respectability. He wanted his church warden's seat. He wanted to be a saint, built on a foundation of cold-blooded theft. So Arthur threatened him," Slack said, pointing at the scrap of paper they had recovered. "The note in the church. I saw you. It wasn't about the robbery itself. It was about Arthur being alive, a living witness to Septimus's absolute cruelty." "And the pin?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes lighting up with the final pieces of the puzzle. Slack looked at the diary again. "It's all in here." Arthur knew his brother had a weak heart. He didn't want to kill him with a knife that's too messy for a man who spent 10 years in a cellar. He wanted to kill him with fear. He followed him. He watched him. He reminded him of the past at every turn. "But there's one thing I don't get. A final entry here." Slack pointed to the last line in the diary, written in a different, firmer and more feminine hand. "Septimus thinks I'm the only one. He doesn't know about the girl. She has her mother's eyes and her father's temper." Miss Marple felt a cold draught into the room, despite the summer heat. The girl. She thought back to the church, to the way Septimus had stiffened before he even opened the book. She thought of the tailor's pin found in the pew. "Inspector," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like the wind through the eaves of an empty house. The pin wasn't for butterflies. It was for a specific kind of dress, a dress made of fine silk. A dress that was being repaired in the vestry on Saturday night while the village slept and the moon was high. Chapter 5. The Final Stitch. The vestry of St. Azur. Bartholomew was a small, cluttered room filled with heavy choir robes, stacked prayer books, and the lingering, suffocating smell of lavender, old paper, and incense. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack stood in the centre of the cramped space, their eyes fixed on the large, ornate oak wardrobe that dominated the far wall. "The girl," Miss Marple said, her voice echoing strangely against the stone. "Arthur Blane had a daughter. He left her in the north when he died. She grew up knowing her uncle had stolen her father's life and left her in poverty. She came here, not as a collector, but as someone we all trusted, someone who could hide in plain sight among the innocent. She walked to the wardrobe and pulled out a long, dark choir robe. Beneath it, hidden in the deep shadows of the velvet, was a dress, a silk dress, deep navy blue with a single silver-headed pin still stuck in the hem, glinting like a cold, solitary tear in the dim light. Mrs. Pringle?" Slack asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. "No," Miss Marple said, shaking her head. "Mrs. Pringle is too clumsy for this kind of surgical revenge. Think of someone who knows the church like the back of her hand, someone who is always here, always quiet, always observing the sins of others, while her own heart burns with an old fire." The door to the vestry opened with a slow, deliberate creak. Mary, the vicar's niece, stood there. She was 22, with a face that was usually described as sweet, and eyes that were currently as cold and deep as a winter pond. "I wondered how long it would take you," Mary said. Her voice was steady, devoid of the soft stutter she usually used to appear harmless to the villagers. "My uncle Septimus was a thief. He let my father rot in a cellar while he played the saint in this village. He bought his soul with blood money and expected us to thank him for it." "And the note?" Slack asked, his hand moving toward the handcuffs on his belt. "My father wrote that," Mary said, a flicker of profound disgust crossing her face. "He was weak. He just wanted money to buy a better life. But I wanted more. I wanted him to die where he felt most safe, in that pew, with everyone watching him fail. I wanted him to know that God was watching him too. "The pin?" Miss Marple asked. "I dropped it when I was planting the letter in his hymnal on Saturday night," Mary said, looking down at her pale hands. "I was fixing my dress for the service. I didn't think anyone would notice a tiny silver pin in a church full of brass and stone. I forgot that the smallest things are often the loudest when the world is quiet." "But Miss Marple notices everything," Slack grunted, signalling for the constable waiting in the hall. As they led Mary away, the church bells began to toll for the midday hour. The sound was the same as it had always been, heavy, rhythmic, and certain. Miss Marple walked back into the main body of the church. She looked at the fourth pew on the left. It was empty now, the wood looking old, tired, and abandoned. The dust mote still danced in the light, and the stone walls still held their secrets, though one had finally been pulled into the harsh light of day. She picked up her prayer book from the floor where it had been forgotten. She felt the weight of it in her hand. "Human nature," she whispered to the empty aisles, her voice full of a deep, ancient sadness. "It is the same in a bank vault as it is in a choir loft. We all have our pews, and we all have our pews, and we all have our pins, and eventually we all have to answer for the fabric we have woven." She walked out into the village green. The sun was still high, the gardens were still blooming, and St. Pesci, Mary Mead, was once again a place of Sabbath silence. But as she walked home, Miss Marple knew that the silence was just a cover for the next story waiting to be told. Chapter 6. The Joviwis of the Past. The days following the arrest of Mary and the disappearance of the man in the grey macintosh felt different in St. Arche, Mary Mead, as if the very air had become denser, more difficult to breathe. The scandal was a dark ink blot on the pristine white linen of the village's reputation. In the post office, at the butcher's, and over the garden fences, the whispers were no longer about the weather or the price of eggs. They were about the nature of a man like Septimus Blane. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the knitting needles in her hands moving with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. She was working on a shawl for the upcoming winter, a soft grey wool that seemed to match the mood of her thoughts. She thought of Septimus, a man who had spent 40 years building a cathedral of respectability upon a foundation of theft and betrayal. She wondered if he had ever truly felt safe, or if every time he sat in that fourth pew, he was waiting for the tap on the shoulder that finally came in the form of a scrap of paper. She thought of Arthur Blane, the brother who had been hidden away like a shameful secret, 10 years in a cellar, a decade of darkness, while his own flesh and blood enjoyed the sunlight and the praise of the parish. The man in the grey macintosh was not a murderer in the eyes of the law, but he had acted as a catalyst for a reckoning that was 3 decades in the making. He was a ghost who had reclaimed his voice, only to find that there was nothing left to say but, "I saw you." And then there was Mary. Miss Marple's heart ached for the girl who had grown up with a father who was a ghost, and an uncle who was a monster. Mary had inherited her father's temper, a cold, burning fire that had eventually consumed her own future. She had sought justice in the holiest of places, but she had found only vengeance, leaving the church of St. Bartholomew haunted by the memory of a man clawing at his throat while the congregation sang of abiding light. Inspector Slack returned to the county town, his notebook filled with the facts of the case, but his mind likely unsettled by the complexities of the village. He had his arrest, he had his confession, and he had his evidence in the form of a tiny, silver-headed tailor's pin. But the law deals in actions, and Miss Marple knew that the true crime had started long before a pin was dropped or a letter was planted. It had started with a choice made in a bank vault 30 years ago, a choice to value gold over blood. The evening shadows began to stretch across the lawn, reaching toward the cottage as the sun dipped behind the ancient oaks. The church bells began to toll once more. The sound carried on the wind. It was the same sound Septimus had heard every week, but now it felt like a morning song for the innocence that St. Mary Mead pretended to possess. Miss Marple stood up, folding her knitting and tucking it into her basket. She looked toward the village, where the lights were beginning to flicker on in the windows. Life would go on, as it always did. The gardens would be tended, the tea would be poured, and the secrets would be buried once again. But beneath the surface, the truth remained, a silver pin in the dark, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see. The case was bound and shelved. Another story in the long history of the village, the pews of But Bartholomew would be filled again next Sunday, but the fourth seat on the left would remain empty for a long time, a silent testament to the man who forgot that the smallest things are often the loudest. Chapter 7. The final reckoning. The seasons in St. Mary Mead have a way of overlapping, much like the secrets of its inhabitants. As the summer heat began to wane, replaced by the crisp golden breath of autumn, the village seemed to settle into a new kind of equilibrium. The trial of Mary Blane had been swift, a sombre affair in a distant county court that felt far removed from the quiet lanes of the village. The evidence was undeniable: the diary, the photograph, the testimony of a tailor, and that singular silver-headed pin that had become a symbol of a life unravelled. Miss Marple often walked past the churchyard in the evenings, watching the swallows gather on the power lines for their long journey south. She noticed that the vicar had become more stoic, his sermons carrying a deeper weight of forgiveness and the complexity of the human soul. He never spoke of his niece, nor of the man who had died in the front pew, but the empty space in the congregation was a wound that refused to close. The village had a long memory, and while they would eventually return to discussing the price of wool and the winner of the marrow competition, the ghost of Septimus Blane would always be there. Sitting in the shadows of the fourth pew, she thought often of the man in the grey macintosh. Arthur Blane had never been seen again. Some said he had gone to London. Others believed he had returned to the north to find the life he had lost 30 years prior. Miss Marple suspected he was simply a man who had completed his mission, a man who had spent 10 years in a cellar and 20 more in a fog of resentment, only to find that revenge, once achieved, leaves one as empty as the person who was destroyed. He was a wanderer once more, carrying the weight of a shared secret that no longer had a home. One afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back at the tailor's shop. Mystery Span. Jenkins was still there, angular and precise, working on a heavy winter coat. He looked up, his spectacles catching the low afternoon sun. "I heard the news, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a tiny piece of steel can hold so much power." "It isn't the steel, Mr. Jenkins," she replied, her voice soft and certain. "It is the intent behind it. A pin can hold a hem, or it can hold a heart. It is all in how we choose to use the tools we are given." She left the shop and walked toward the Blue Boar, where the sign creaked in the autumn wind. The village felt like an old book where the final page had been turned, but the story lingered in the mind. She knew that there would be more stories. There would always be more stories, because human nature is a restless thing, constantly weaving new patterns of greed, love, and fear. She reached her cottage and went inside, the warmth of the kitchen greeting her like an old friend. She put the kettle on, the sound of the water beginning to simmer, a comforting, familiar music. She looked at her knitting. The grey shawl was almost finished. It was a solid, tangible thing, made of thousands of small, interconnected loops. One wrong stitch, and the whole thing could eventually pull apart. She sat in her chair by the fire, the light of the flames dancing on the walls. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the village, the distant tolling of the bell, the rustle of the wind in the trees, the quiet settling of the house wash over her. The mystery of the secret letter was over. The truth had been told. The pins had been gathered. In St. Mary Mead, the night is long and the stars are bright. The secrets may be buried, but they are never truly gone. They are part of the soil, part of the stone, and part of the people. And as long as there are those who are willing to look, and those who are willing to listen, the truth will always find its way home. The world is quiet now. The shadows have found their rest. The story is complete. Good night, detectives. Sleep well, sleep deep. The morning will come, but for now there is only the peace of the Sabbath silence. If you found yourself captivated by the shadows of St. Bartholomew and the secret of the church warden's pew, you know that in St. Mary Mead, one confession rarely tells the whole story. As the village settles back into its uneasy peace, a new silence has begun to take hold, one that carries the weight of a different kind of legacy. Join Miss Marple once more, as she uncovers a mystery where the greatest clues are not found in letters, but in the things left unsaid. This is The Inheritance of Silence, Chapter 1. The Estate of Gossington Hall. The dust had barely settled on the scandal of the church warden when a new shadow began to stretch across the village. It began at the gates of Gossington Hall, the grand ivy-clad estate that stood as a silent witness to the changing fortunes of the village. The owner, old Colonel Arthur Prothero, a man whose bark was notoriously worse than his bite, had passed away in his sleep. To the village, it was a natural end to a long, loud life, but to those who stood to inherit the Colonel's vast estate, his death was merely the opening of a door that had been locked for 40 years. Miss Marple sat in her small, sun-drenched parlour, her knitting needles clicking a rhythmic accompaniment to her thoughts. She had known the Colonel. He was a man of rigid schedules and even more rigid opinions. He was also a man who kept a very large, very heavy iron safe in his study safe that had not been opened since the end of the Great War. The air in the village seemed to hang heavy with anticipation. Gossington Hall was a place of high stone walls and secret gardens, a maze of mahogany-panelled rooms and draughty hallways, where the smell of old beeswax and pipe tobacco lingered like a ghost. For years the Colonel had lived there in a state of self-imposed exile, surrounded by his collection of military medals and the whispers of a scandal that had never quite been put to rest. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. She remembered the rumours of 1922, the missing jewels from the Duchess of Sutherland's collection. The Colonel had been a guest at the Duchess's estate that weekend, and when the diamonds vanished, the shadow had fallen on him. He was never charged, for lack of evidence. But the village never forgets. In St. Mary Mead, a lack of evidence is often seen as a lack of creativity on the part of the police. Chapter 2. The Reading of the Will. The reading of the will was held on a Tuesday afternoon, a day when the sky was a bruised purple and the air smelled of ozone and impending rain. The family gathered in the library, a room that smelled of old leather and wood smoke. There was the nephew Raymond, a man whose expensive silk tie couldn't hide the desperate hunger in his eyes. There was the niece, Sylvia, who sat with a lace handkerchief pressed to her lips, looking as though she were perpetually mourning a life she had never quite managed to live. And then there was the housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, a woman who had served the Colonel for 30 years and knew the location of every loose floorboard in the house. The solicitor, Mr. D. Fanshawe, who looked like he was made of parchment and dry ink, cleared his throat. The sound was like a twig snapping in a silent forest. The Colonel was a man of specific intentions, Fanshawe began, his eyes skimming the heavy document. He leaves the house and the grounds to Raymond and Sylvia to be shared equally. But the contents of the safe, the primary legacy as he called it, that is to be left to the person who can provide the missing key. A silence fell over the room, a thick, suffocating silence. "The key?" Raymond demanded, his voice high and thin. "What key? Uncle Arthur never mentioned a key." "He mentioned it to me," Mrs. Croft said softly from the corner of the room. She was knitting a dark, shapeless garment, her eyes fixed on her needles. "He said the key was hidden in the one place where no one ever looks, but everyone always sees." Miss Marple, who had been invited as a friend of the family, looked toward the mantelpiece. On it sat a large gilded clock, its pendulum swinging with a heavy, indifferent tick. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound felt like a heartbeat in the quiet room. Chapter 3. The Night of the Wandering Light. The first night at Gossington Hall was a night of restless ghosts and wandering footsteps. Raymond and Sylvia had stayed in the guest rooms, their presence in the house feeling like a foreign intrusion. The rain finally broke, lashing against the high stone walls and rattling the leaded windows. Inside the library, the iron safe stood like a silent monolith. Miss Marple had stayed the night as well, at the insistence of the terrified Sylvia. She lay in the great four-poster bed in the blue room, her eyes open, listening to the house breathe. Old houses have a language of their own, the groan of the timber, the sigh of the chimneys, the scratching of mice behind the wainscoting. But tonight there was another sound, a soft, sliding sound. Miss Marple rose, her movements as quiet as a shadow. She put on her thick woolen dressing gown and picked up her candle. She crept to the door and peered into the hallway. The corridor was a tunnel of darkness. At the far end, near the library door, she saw a flicker of light, a flashlight. She followed the light, her heart beating a steady, unfrightened rhythm. She reached the library door and looked inside. Someone was standing in front of the safe. They were holding a magnifying glass, examining the dial. It was not Raymond, it was not Sylvia. It was the solicitor, Mr. Fanshawe. Miss Marple stepped into the room, her candle casting long, dancing shadows against the rows of books. "The key is not in the dial, Mr. Fanshawe." The colonel was a man of mechanics, not mathematics. Fanshawe spun around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly. "Miss Marple, you startled me." "I imagine I did," she said, her voice calm. "You are looking for the inheritance, aren't you? Not the legal one, the real one, the Duchess's jewels." Fanshawe's face turned the colour of bone. "The jewels vanished 40 years ago. This is about the colonel's estate." "The colonel's estate is the jewels," Miss Marple said gently. "And you were his solicitor for 40 years. You were the one who helped him hide the truth about 1922, but you don't have the key, because the colonel didn't trust you. He only trusted his pride." Chapter 4: The Secret of the Silver Cufflinks. The investigation reached its breaking point when Inspector Slack arrived the next morning, his boots clattering on the stone floor. He looked at the tampered safe and then at Miss Marple with a look of utter exhaustion. "Another safe, Miss Marple. Don't tell me a secret code hidden in a cross-stitch sampler." "Not a sampler, Inspector. A suit." Miss Marple led the inspector to the colonel's dressing room. She pointed to a photograph on the wall, the colonel, in his full dress uniform, standing proud and stern. "Look at the cufflinks, Inspector. Silver, shaped like tiny, ornate keys. He wore them every Sunday for 40 years. They were his good luck charms." "So," Slack grunted, "the colonel was buried in that suit, Inspector, and he was buried with those cufflinks." A realization dawned on Slack's face. "You're saying someone robbed the grave?" "I'm saying someone tried," Miss Marple corrected. "But they were interrupted. If you check the vault, I suspect you will find it disturbed. But the person who really has the key, they didn't need to go to the graveyard." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Marple, Croft, the housekeeper, who was standing in the doorway, her hands tucked into her apron. "Mrs. Croft," Miss Marple said, "the colonel was a very lonely man. He had a habit of losing things, didn't he? And you were the one who always found them. You found the spare set of cufflinks years ago, didn't you? The ones he thought he had lost in London." Mrs. Croft's face didn't change, but her eyes darkened. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a cufflink, shaped exactly like a miniature key. "He promised me, Mrs. Brough," Croft whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden violent emotion. "He promised me in his will that I would be provided for. 30 years of cleaning his boots and keeping his secrets, and then he leaves me a riddle. He wanted to play one last game with his family, and he didn't care if I was left with nothing." "So you took the key," Slack said. "I took it," she said. She walked to the safe, inserted the tiny silver key into a hidden keyhole disguised as a decorative bolt, and turned it. Click. The heavy iron door swung open. The family crowded forward, gasping in anticipation. But the safe was empty. Inside, there were no diamonds, no Duchess's jewels. There was only a single folded piece of paper. Miss Marple picked it up and read it aloud. "To my dear family, The jewels were sold in 1923 to pay for the Duchess's silence. The only thing I have left to leave you is the silence itself. Enjoy the house. It is built on a foundation of air. Chapter 5. The calm after the storm. The scandal of the empty safe was the talk of the Blue Ball for months. Mrs. Mead Croft was not charged after all. She had simply opened a safe that contained nothing. But she left the village shortly after, her 30 years of service ending in a bitter, hollow victory. Raymond and Sylvia were left with a grand estate they couldn't afford to heat and a legacy of debt. Mr. Fanshawe retired to the coast, haunted by the thought of a mystery that had no prize at the end. Miss Marple sat in her garden as the autumn leaves began to fall, their colours a vibrant gold against the grey stone of her cottage. She picked up her knitting. The wool was soft, the needles clicking with a steady, comforting rhythm. The inheritance of silence, she whispered to the roses, a house full of echoes, and a family full of regrets. She thought of the Colonel. He had kept the village guessing for 40 years, guarding an empty safe with the same ferocity as if it held the crown jewels. In the end, his greatest secret was that he had no secret at all. He had lived a life of pretense, and he had made sure that his death was just as spectacular a fraud. Inspector Slack had returned to the city, his notebook filled with facts, but his mind likely unsettled by the strange logic of St. Mary Mead. He had sought a crime, but he had found only a tragedy of pride. Miss Marple smiled as she finished a row of her knitting. Life would go on, the tea would be poured, the bells would toll, and the gardens would grow. But beneath the surface, the mysteries would always remain, waiting for a sharp pair of eyes, and a mind that knows that even in the quietest of places, the loudest truths are often the ones left unsaid. And so the curtains close on another chapter of St. Mary Mead. The hall is quiet, the safe is open, and the ghosts have finally been laid to rest. But as the sun sets over the village and the lights flicker on in the cottages, remember, the greatest mysteries are often the ones we carry within ourselves. Good night, detectives. Sleep well.
Thank you.